Pinter is sometimes accused of being a clinically observant writer. In fact, he seems to be someone whose vision embraces both passion and compassion for the individual. I use the word poetry in the title because Pinter's language famously takes the seeming banalities of everyday speech and discovers in them rhythms and patterns and echoes for which the only word is poetic. What Pinter has also explored, it seems to me, is the difference between poetry in the theatre, i.e. formal verse, and poetry of the theatre. The ability to distill a situation and to endow it with maximum resonance. The climaxes to The Caretaker and No Man's Land, with their images of human solitude, seem to be perfect examples of that. And I use the word politics because it's a vital part of Pinter's life and work. He explores politics inside personal relationships, but far from being an addendum to his work as a dramatist, Pinter's political activism seems to be an extension of it. Time and again, he explores the way language is misused by politicians and the way rhetoric is deployed to conceal reality. Pinter, in his Nobel speech, has unmasked the lies and deceptions of public life. But I shall have a chance to talk about these and other issues with Harold Pinter himself on Saturday morning. This symposium is for others to have their say, and we have a very wide variety of speakers, both today, Friday, and on Sunday. We've also got a very large agenda to get through in very little time, so without further ado, I would like to both welcome you to the symposium and welcome the individual speakers. What will happen is they will each talk for varying lengths, maximum, I think, of 30 minutes, or even 35, a minimum, in some cases, of 10 to 15. And I'm very pleased to welcome the first speaker, who is a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine in London, Alistair Macaulay, who is the drama critic of the Financial Times, one of our most prestigious newspapers. And Alistair, I think, is going to talk on the subject of Pinter's women. So, Alistair Macaulay.
And I apologise straight away to the translators because I'm just speaking from clumsy notes, so they'll be working to keep up with me. Last year, I felt the same pang as everybody else here when Harold Pinter let it be known that he was unlikely to write any more plays. And as you may remember, he indicated that he was intending to concentrate his remaining artistic energies on poetry. And I was curious to know what kind of poetry he intended to go on writing. And the next time I saw him, I plucked up courage and said, "Harold, is all your poetry at the moment about war, cancer, death?" But I pay a different kind of attention when he himself mentions God the Almighty, God the Creator, as he does in a 1996 interview when the subject turns to women. And this is what he says. There's a terrible two-line poem by Kingsley Amis in which he says, "Women are so much nicer than men. No wonder we like them." This is Pinter. What does he mean by that? There's no one pattern to the women in Harold Pinter's work. They come from upper class, middle class, lower class. Some are weak, some are strong, some both. Some have children, some parents, some sisters, some husbands. And some seem to have come out. Even the weakest and most vulnerable characters in Pinter tend to have space about them most of the time. It's part of their mystery, part of what cannot be violated. And he tends to place more space and time around certain women than he ever does about certain men. The other chief device whereby a character in Pinter will show their freedom from anyone else on stage is the non sequitur. One of the supreme non sequiturs occurs in The Homecoming. The men have been talking of this and that, and for too strict your observations to that. Perhaps the fact that they move is more significant than the words which come through them. You must bear that possibility in mind. All those pauses are written in, by the way. I was born quite near here. Then, 6 years ago, I went to America. It's all rock and sand. It stretches so far, everywhere you look, and there's lots of insects there. And there's lots of insects there. And in that speech, she changes the entire play, wresting it away from what they've been talking about. She states a whole lot of things in this little speech. For one thing, she says that this is her homecoming too. She comes from near here. She says, "Watch what I do. Actions speak louder than words." She uses her sexual allure. But she also acquires a certain pathos. She went to America, but it isn't home. It's arid, and it has these damned insects. And she goes on, from the rest of the play, to shake off her own husband, to become instead a lover, a wife, a mother to the other men in his family, and probably to many other men to come. She plays these men's game, but on her own terms. It's dismaying to watch, but it's also among the most breathtaking acts of independence in the whole of Pinter. Now, when we talk about Pinter's women, let's not kid ourselves. In giving voice to individual female characters, he's not just saying, this is what women are like and men are not. This is what I desire or admire or fear or distrust in women. That's one part of it. But he's also, of course, giving voice to one aspect of himself. Marvellous and memorable as plays like The Homecoming and The Lover and other early Pinter plays are, and their women, I believe that he went on to greater, more audacious, more difficult plays, in some cases with women who achieve a much stranger and more painful kind of independence, a kind of isolation. And to my mind, the greatest Pinter starts around 1968, and one of the distinctions that makes me separate these two periods of his work are to do with if I own to enjoy him, the bargain's bare. The fault of alarm he does not share. I die the dear ritual, and he is my beer, and beer is spelled B-I-E-R, as in coffin. Well, it's a thoroughly enigmatic poem, but her tone is open, honest, because she so completely comprehends the tension, the ambiguity of male-female relations. They're large in her mind. You can't think long about Pinter without feeling that within this out-and-out modernist, say that his male-female dialogues are expression of animus and anima. But since I don't drop that down. The moment when Pinter first fully gave voice to these separate male-female principles comes in his 1968 play, Landscape. And I think he never wrote anything more perfect before or since. Duff and Beth sit at a table and talk, but they seem never to hear each other. The difference is, he talks to me. He supported my shoulder. So tender his touch on my neck. So softly his kiss on my cheek. My hand on his rib. So sweetly the sand over me. Tiny the sand on my skin. So silent the sky in my eyes. Gently the sound of the tide. Oh, my true love, I said. End of play. Really, this is, I think, the modernist version of a romantic mad scene. She's singing of love and bliss and rapture. Everyone else, in a realm of blunt prose, knows that she's out of her wits. And yet, she is happier and freer, and in a more important sense, larger.
What did the compulsive search conducted over a 40-year period since the late 1950s uncover? It is based on my personal collection of materials by and about Pinter. This began when, as a schoolboy on the south coast of England, it must have been, but here there are no hard distinctions between what is real and what is not real, a response to the broadcast on the BBC third programme in 29th of July 1959 of A Slight Ache, or the search, the endeavour, may really have been triggered by a Saturday afternoon matinee early in 1960 at the Theatre Royal Brighton up in the Gods, the pre-London run of The Caretaker, mixed smashing of pieces of Aston's Buddha still haunts the memory. Violence. Shortly after this visit, I managed to obtain a copy of The Caretaker, which I still have. Not the Encore first edition, difficult to find, increasingly so, but the first Methuen paperback edition in blue covers, of which apparently 7,500 copies were initially printed. Still, I remember that the scene of the Buddha smashing lacked the detail found in the theatrical experience. But the theatrical performance changes with each performance, depending on the director, the actors and the audience, and so on. Printed texts of the play have undergone revisions. At least 4 printings of The Caretaker before 1966 contain verbal changes. A revised hardback and cloth appeared in 1962, less than a year after the first Methuen edition.
I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by the figure of 125 newspaper interviews, and this, at least, and this from a writer famous for his reclusiveness. As Harold's wife famously said, into review, and can I just, before announcing that, actually, can I just make another announcement that the meeting with Korsunovus is now postponed until Sunday. I'll come back to that later on. I'm sorry to interrupt, Susan. I think it best if you introduce the title of your talk, because I don't know quite where you would like to put the emphasis. Anyway, a great pleasure in inviting Susan Hollis Merritt to address the symposium. Susan.
I just want to make, the mic is on, is that right? You can hear. I have several kinds of titles. This is actually the dual politics. And then if that were not enough, a parenthetical explanation of what the paper is actually about. It's an intersubjective, intercontextual reading of Harold Pinter's Nobel lecture, Art, Truth, and Politics. And you will hear echoes of earlier papers in my paper, since several other people and after me will be quoting the same passages. But I think what would be interesting is the different contexts in which we quote the same words. I have a little poem which has already been quoted, fortunately, as Harold Pinter wrote it, by my colleague Bill Baker. So with apologies and thanks to Harold Pinter and to Len Hutton. I knew Harold Pinter in his day. Another play. That's my version. I clearly am not a poet.
To carve out the memory of loss and the loss of memory. We are owed and we owe an accounting for everything done in our name. We are not permitted to live or die like a dog. Quote, "Mother, you can speak," close quotes. This is the forbidden message of mountain language and all the work. The Pinter message. Don't let them tell you what to do, is uncannily close to that of the playwright's ancestor of the 5th century before our era. Euripides, like Harold Pinter, became a fugitive from the camp of victory. In his 70s, the father of the modern theater was branded a traitor for his opposition to the endless war with Sparta and was driven into exile to the remote valleys of Macedon to write one last play and to die. Like a modern Euripides, the British bard has also risked prison to expose the state's criminal war agenda. "I feel so pure," boasts one torturer to his fellow in a late Pinter play. The author answers this official scandal. He forces the bureaucrat and all of us to face the dead. Quote the last verse. "Did it abandoned? Did you kiss the dead body?" This the last stanza of the great poem, Death, Births and Deaths Registration Act, 1953, bores into the hard heart of power with Euripidean soon to die. Written in 416 BCE after Athens' genocidal destruction of Milos. It was Euripides' death warrant. So it was that almost all Athens rejoiced at the sight.
I want to first thank Michael Billington and the first interview with Pinter, one of those exclusive interviews in 1984 in that wonderful London study of his. Anticipating my first sabbatical, I spent a considerable bit of time composing my very first letter to Harold Pinter, letting him know that I'd published a few pieces on his work and that I would be delighted if he could find the time to sit for an interview during my time in London when I'd be researching the film and television work at the BBC and the British Film Institute. Generously, he spent about 90 minutes with me in a very pleasant conversation. And soon after I returned to Las Vegas, he sent me typescripts of two then unpublished scripts, his still unproduced adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Victory and his adaptation of Russell Hoban's Turtle Diary. I was thrilled, of course, and eventually published what I think was the first essay on Victory. Turtle Diary I've written about but haven't published anything on. It plays a wonderfully comic part in my personal life, but that's to be discussed over grappa, I think. In the fall of 2000, Faber and Faber's wondrous 3-volume collection of Harold Pinter's screenplays appeared. Not surprisingly to those who know their Pinter film script history, Pinter elected not to publish 3 of his completed film scripts, The Handmaid's Tale, The Remains of the Day, and Lolita. Therein lies the tale, the reasons for Pinter's decision not to publish these masterful film scripts. We can all thank our various lucky stars that they are now available in the Pinter Archive at the British Library and in a few private collections. Between 1987 and 1991, Pinter wrote 3 intensely political film scripts, Reunion, The Handmaid's Tale, and The Remains of the Day. During a 2-hour interview in October 1994, Pinter spoke with Stephen Gale and myself about, among other things, how pleased he was with his script adaptation of Fred Ullman's Reunion and the film that resulted, particularly with its success at showing the effects of a period of horrific history through the personal vision of one man whose life has been destroyed by those historical forces and by too many of his fellow citizens' failure to resist them. Conrad, whose resistance has proved fatal, we understand as a man of moral courage, of a nobility that is spine-tingling in its selflessness and its rightness. All of Pinter's political works, including his script for The Handmaid's Tale, derive a worldview through the central perspective of one individual rather than attempting a more epic, sweeping vision. Historical, romantic melodrama, posing as serious. The history of the Adrian Lynn, Lolita, is the most bizarre of the lot. In my 1994 interview with Pinter, he told me that he had thoroughly enjoyed writing a film script based on Milton's Lolita, which at the time he fully expected.
Imagine it taking place on the Acropolis in Athens. The Greek tragedians and audience alike would recognize in Harold Pinter a kindred spirit in at least 2 aspects, which are as important to us today as they were at that time to Athens. First, the destructive force of hubris, of overreaching pride, and the consequent implied need to walk humbly among one's fellow humans in a world that is ultimately mysterious and beyond our human illusion of control. Here, Pinter is most akin to Aeschylus and Sophocles. Secondly, in Euripides' consistent attack on the prevalent myths of his time, God justified war, the self-justifying, all-powerful state, and the subservient position of women. Most of all, in his quarrel with the use of myth to absolve both individuals and nations from responsibility and blame, the failure of power without understanding. Indeed, reading Agamemnon, we discover another affinity that Harold Pinter has with Aeschylus. Both recognize that the past exists in the present, not simply as remembrance, but as divided, as it is seen differently, as a source of power, as it is constantly rewritten based on current needs, desire, and as constraint, as one version of it is forced upon another or upon others. In the Agamemnon, Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, like Pinter's characters in old times, for example, inhabit different presents because they inhabit different pasts. He, of hard duty done for God and country, she of a daughter's blood which touches every moment of the present, up to Agamemnon's.